Introduction to the History of Prehistoric Egypt until the mid-19th century. The world's knowledge of ancient Egyptian history remains scant and meager due to the inability to read its inscriptions. Indeed, a fair number of ancient Greek and Roman writers who came to Egypt seeking to witness its wonders described the country in detail and wrote as much as they could about its glorious history. Unfortunately, all of their writings that have reached us were either taken from narratives or simply geographical descriptions. These accounts remained our only source for the history of ancient Egypt until the early 19th century. The most important of these writers was the historian Herodotus, among others, who traveled to Egypt during the reigns of the kings Strabo, Diodorus Siculus, the Ptolemies, and the Roman period. Thus, the true history of the country before the Ptolemaic era remained a secret, which Manetho remains obscure. We know nothing about it except what has reached us through the Egyptian historian Manetho. He wrote a history of the country during the Ptolemaic era, apparently based on ancient Egyptian sources. Unfortunately, only a brief summary of it has reached us, which is insufficient. However, much of what he mentioned in his book has not been verified by the original sources found so far. After the secrets of the Egyptian language were revealed, the world continued to rely on what Greek writers and Manetho's summary left us for its information about Egyptian history. We had no way to correct their errors and fill the gaps that hindered researchers in the country's history. For this reason, some scholars attempted to decipher the Egyptian language in order to gain insight into the country's history. However, this did not yield satisfactory results. However, since the real Karshur, like the father of the French campaign, landed on the banks of the Nile, a new page in the country's history began. While French soldiers were fighting the Mamluks, there was another French scientific expedition whose members toured the length and breadth of the country, studying it in a systematic, scientific manner from all aspects. They researched the country's geography, its fauna, flora, various crops, and crafts. They then studied the people's morals, customs, and antiquities, and transcribed the ancient inscriptions that were then visible on the country's temples. After that, they carefully and meticulously documented all their research in a special book comprising several volumes. Unfortunately, history has benefited from all of this research, except for a few minor points. This is because the inscriptions they copied from temples and elsewhere remained silent. Their decipherment, as we will mention later, was not possible. From the time of Champollion's decipherment of the Egyptian language until the arrival of the Egyptians, the true history of the country gradually began to emerge, eliminating the myths and legends transmitted by Greek writers who visited and wrote about the Nile Valley. These myths have remained, in the eyes of the world, considered to be the country's reliable history to this day. During the period during which Egyptologists were making steady strides in uncovering the true history of the country, thanks to the tremendous efforts being made in excavations and deciphering the inscriptions on the walls of temples and on papyrus in the Nile Valley. There were other great efforts being made by a group of European scholars to lay the foundation for another new science on the other side of the Mediterranean. This new science was prehistory. At its beginning, it had no solid foundation when compared to Egyptian archaeology. Its essence was limited to seeking to resolve the question of the origin of man before history, or in other words, before the advent of writing. By studying the remains of human bones and other artifacts left behind by their owners, either neglected or buried on the surface of the earth, or found buried in caves and caverns, or in ancient riverbeds, the result was finally achieved by some scientists, after intense opposition, such as Boucher, in establishing the foundations of this science. In fact, after half a century of effort, the two scientists were able to produce a book exploring the prehistoric era. After them, a group of Bernese and other scientists succeeded in establishing the foundations of this science through their research until it became recognized in all scientific circles in Europe. It is surprising that some ancient writers spoke of this science before it was known and established its foundations. The Latin poet Lucrez pointed out that the first man was ignorant of the use of metals, and so he skillfully used wood, bones, and especially polished stones to make tools and weapons for hunting and war. Later, man became a farmer. and then began to improve his tools and sharpen the edge of his axe. In fact, this is consistent with historical facts. We find that the Stone Age saw the use of refined and then polished iron, followed by an era of sophistication and gradual advancement, the era of metal use. It is noteworthy that with the advent of metals, the use of iron gradually declined. It is not surprising that the use of copper, followed by the invention of bronze, which was briefly replaced by iron, was one of the things that advanced humankind's progress, even to the historic era, that is, the era of writing and reading, in documenting all of its events and deeds. However, not all nations of the world reached this level at the same speed, or simultaneously. For example, Egypt and the Chaldean countries knew how to write and read thousands of years before the Christian era, while they remained ignorant of the new developments for a long time. On the other hand, we observe that the inhabitants of the Mediterranean kingdoms remained buried in the darkness of prehistory for several centuries, yet they had known how to use iron long before the Roman conquest. Surprisingly, the research of prehistoric scholars remained unrecognized by Egyptologists for most of the 19th century. This was because these archaeologists doubted the existence of an era in Egyptian history before the Old Kingdom. They believed that the inhabitants of Egypt did not have a childhood like other nations, but rather that they had suddenly emerged into history, and that their civilization was almost complete. Therefore, archaeologists refused to investigate the origin of this flourishing culture, which was bound to gradually reach its present state over several centuries. For this reason, they refused to examine stone tools found accidentally during excavations or collected from the surface of the earth. They interpreted their presence as natural artifacts or as having been manufactured during the Pharaonic dynasty. Thus, the struggle among archaeologists continued until the arrival of the French scholar Archelin Arslan in the Nile Valley. He was the first to prove the existence of prehistory in Egypt, and he supported his claim with evidence. This scholar came to Egypt in 1868 and traveled up and down the Nile. During his journey, he conducted productive research. From the edge of the desert on which the pyramids were built, he collected some refined squid instruments similar to those found in Europe. He was even more fortunate. On the plateau overlooking the Valley of the Kings towards Luxor, he found a large squid factory dating back to the Paleolithic period. It has been shown that what was found in this spot resembles the Paleolithic. To the south of the aforementioned spot, many of these were found at Saint Ashul and at Abu Minker. Some Neolithic instruments were found. Shortly after this discovery, the scientists Henry and Lainerman found some very important instruments near the Theban necropolis. As a result of this discovery, the Society for the Study of the Descent of Man acknowledged in 1870 the possibility of a prehistoric era in Egypt. This view was supported by the discoveries Richard had made in the Sinai Peninsula, in the vicinity of Cairo, and in Thebes. However, despite this, archaeologists were opposed to the existence of prehistory in Egypt, arguing that they had found instruments similar to those found by these researchers in ancient Egyptian tombs. They did not understand that these instruments were perhaps relics of prehistoric times and had remained in use by inheritance, such as Lepsius and Merit Pasha, and the custom until historical times. Archaeologists such as these remained steadfast in their opinion despite the attempts of prehistorians to convince them of the validity of the Shaba's era in Egyptian history before the Old Kingdom. This continued for more than 30 years until the director, Jacques, established the De Morgan, Things in Order, is a scholar of Egyptian antiquities at that time. He compiled in 2 massive volumes everything written on the subject. His research ultimately supported the idea of a prehistoric era in Egypt. He added to this his personal observations, which he had gathered during his long stay in the Nile Valley. During that time, he studied the conditions and locations where stone tools were found, and demonstrated with convincing evidence the antiquity of the prehistoric tools compared to the tools that humans had traditionally refined in the style of their predecessors in historical eras and then used. After arriving at this conclusion, he proceeded to demonstrate to scholars that the tools of prehistoric Egypt were almost identical to those preserved in European museums from the same era.